Is Rachel coming out, or or I'm just on first here?
You're on first.
All right, I can actually hear someone. Well, this is not how I expected this event to happen. I have to say I was really, really looking forward to visiting Alabama. And if I'm honest, I was really actually looking forward to visiting anywhere. Because I'm sure it's the case with everyone out there that we've all spent a long time cooped up inside. So I was really excited for a trip. Really sad when this snowstorm hit and no flights went out of Logan yesterday. So I'm just going to pause here and can everyone hear me?
Yes.
And there's no way for me to get information on that. But hopefully someone will chime in if you're having a tough time hearing me.
We can hear you, Peter. We can hear you. You're good.
Oh, good. Oh, good. So anyway, I'm here in my office, wishing I were in Alabama. I'll give you a quick view of my snow situation, if it works. I might just get blown out by the sun here, but if you can see it, yeah, there's all my snow and my lovely little bit of ocean view. So we got quite a storm, and there's my cat too, for the cat lovers out there. So we got quite a storm, but today is a very sunny day, so it is beautiful to be here. I wish I were there. I'll talk a little bit about my journey as a writer, and I'll talk a little bit about my process of writing my books and plotting them. I'm assuming Rachel will talk about some of these things as well, and whether we're different or the same. And then I'm looking forward to taking questions, so I'll talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then hopefully there'll be some questions out there. So a little bit about my journey as a writer. I think I'll go way back and just say that I think every writer's journey starts as a journey as a reader. So as a young child, I was kind of a precocious reader. I read everything I could get my hands on. Huge fan of going to the library weekly with my mom and getting I think there was probably a limitation on the number of books you could get. It was like 10 or something, and I would get 10. And it was the most exciting day of the week, and I would finish all those books pretty much by the end of the day and then have to wait for another week. So I loved to read, and quite early on I realized that what I loved to read most of all was anything that was mystery related. Early on, it was anything that had monsters or suspense or darkness to it. I don't know why that is. It's just what I was drawn to. I remember, I think it was my older sister who got Nancy Drew books first before I got Hardy Boy books. And as soon as she was done with them, I started reading them and really just fell in love with the whole idea of solving a mystery. In any form. So I read Encyclopedia Brown, I read my sister's Nancy Drew books, I read Hardy Boys, and then I noticed, and again I was quite young. I don't know exactly. I want to say like 10 or 11. My mom would get these beach books that looked like mysteries as well, and she would leave them around the house. And I think one of those books was Coma. A book by Robin Cook, which some of you will remember. I think it was a huge book when it came out in 1978. And it was a thriller. It actually had a very, I wish I had a copy of it, I could show it to you. It had a very lurid cover of someone in a coma being hung up by wires. And it was an adult thriller, and I was way too young to read it. But I secretly snuck it away from the living room and read through the book in about a day, and it terrified me. It was both riveting and kind of terrifying at the same time. And it also took place in Boston, which is where I'm from. I'm from outside of Boston, but it was a familiar location, and it was about this organ harvesting evildoers in this hospital, and it was a very violent and adult thriller, and I was hooked completely, despite the terror and despite learning all sorts of things I shouldn't have learned about. So from there on, I went to read Jaws. I remember was another favorite that I read way too early. I read my mom's Robert Parker novels. He was another local writer. I'm sure you've heard of him, wrote the Spencer books. I read those when I was quite young and loved the sort of detective story vibe of those. And eventually I hit Stephen King, Ian Fleming, the James Bond books, and then all sorts of older mid-century crime that I fell in love with. The hard-boiled American stuff I loved, John D. MacDonald, Ross MacDonald, and Agatha Christie, of course, which, I loved her books, and in particular fell madly in love with And Then There Were None, her creepiest story, something that maybe Rachel will talk about as well, because her latest novel involves a bunch of strangers come together on an island where clearly there's just going to be death and mayhem. My most recent book, and I'll show you, this is my most recent paperback novel, Vow You Break. It came out in hardcover last year. It involves an island, actually, as well, and a bad honeymoon. But this is Nine Lives, which is coming out in hardcover in a couple weeks, and that is a book that's a direct homage to Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. In my story, the 9 strangers that come together are actually brought together by all receiving a list in the mail. It's just a list of their name and 8 other names, and none of them know each other, and then one by one they begin to die. And so the mystery of the story becomes not just who will survive, but also why are they being targeted, and do they have something in common, this group of people? They don't think they do, but they actually do. So that's my next one, Nine Lives. I was definitely thinking about Agatha Christie when I wrote it, and how important she was to me as a young reader. So I'll keep talking a little bit about my journey. I mean, I think in high school, as I got older, I got more into literary fiction. I got into poetry, sort of more edgier stuff, all the stuff that you get into as a teenager, I think, Jack Kerouac and Charles Bukowski and stuff like that, and decided I wanted to be a writer. And at that point in time, I was really interested in being a poet and a short story writer. I kind of lost, even though I continued to read mysteries, I was thinking in those terms. And throughout my college years and into my 20s, and even into my 30s, I really focused on being a poet. And wasn't particularly interested in trying my hand at a novel until I think I was around 35, and I thought, why don't I just try and write a novel to see if I can do it? And I think that was my only motivation. I wasn't necessarily thinking publication. I was just thinking, I wonder if I can start a book and write 300 pages and get to the end. And then I thought, well, what kind of book should I write? And I said, well, I've always loved mystery, so I think, they always tell you in writing classes, it's kind of a cliche, but they say, write what you know, which I always think is bad advice, because if everyone wrote what they knew, we wouldn't get science fiction or fantasy, or even historical novels, and we wouldn't necessarily get thrillers and mystery novels. So I always think the advice should be write what you read. In my case, I was still a lover of mysteries, so I said, I'll try and write a mystery novel. And I did it. And I remember that experience, that getting to the end of that first book, and that book was not published, neither was my second book, nor my third book. But there's something about getting to the end of that book and finishing it that was so satisfying, probably, except for the day I found out I was going to become published, probably the best day of my writing life. And I also discovered that I love writing novels, that I love being caught in a big story. And I love writing thriller novels because it's really the only type of idea I get, which are thriller ideas. So, so that's my writer's journey. Well, I'll talk a little bit about how I went from unpublished to published, because I did send out those early books, and like a lot of writers will have the same story, and I got hundreds of rejections. So I sent query letters to agents, got nothing, no interest, a little bit of interest, but it fell through. And then, so I'd written 2 mystery novels that were kind of like classic whodunits with a poetry theme. And then I thought, I'm going to write like a really commercial thriller. And I came up with this idea. It all took place in 24 hours. It involved a bridal party being kidnapped. And I wrote it thinking, this will get published because it's such a great idea. And I wrote the book. I'm pretty convinced this is the worst book I've ever written, because I was writing to get published, and I sent out the query letter, and again, it was silence. No one came back, and I was discouraged, and in my spare time wrote what I thought was a really quirky idea, a story that I wrote just for myself, called "The Girl with a Clock for a Heart," and it was kind of I thought of it as sort of a film noir or hard-boiled noir type of story, but set with college freshmen in the 1980s. And I thought, this is such a weird idea, but I really wanted to do it. So I wrote it. It was a novella. It was about 30,000 words, and sent it to an online magazine, a very obscure one that decided to publish it. And I thought, well, no one will ever read it, first of all, but at least it's out there, and who knows. And I forgot about it, and about a year later I got an email from an agent in New York City who said he'd read the story online, and he loved it, and he wondered if I could turn it into a novel. So obviously the first thing I did was to Google the name of this person and make sure that they were actually legitimate, which they were, which was a surprise. And I started working with this agent, Nat Sobel, and about a year later we sold the novel version of Girl with a Clock for a Heart. So I think the lesson that I learned from that was, write from your heart, write the story that you want to tell. And I had initially thought this would be too weird a story for anyone. But it got me a publishing deal, and I'm still standing. So, so that's that story. I'll talk just a little bit before we go to questions about, because it is a common question, how do you get your ideas? Sometimes that's an easy question, like you can say, well, I had this, I read a newspaper article and it sort of prompted an idea. But usually it's a really hard question to answer, because ideas just sort of bubble up in your subconscious and you suddenly have them, and that's how it works with me. So my process for plotting a book and getting to the point where I start writing a book is really what I call like a daydream process. I usually have an idea, like just a small kernel of an idea will pop into my head, like for 9 Lives, it was, what if instead of these strangers being brought to an island, they got a letter, and that's what connected them. So I have this idea, and I don't write it down. In fact, I don't write anything down before I start writing. I just let it sort of grow in my head, and it's sort of a daydream process. So, I'll start thinking about it. I'll lie in bed and I'll go, well, who would these characters be? What would happen next? And what generally happens with ideas like this is I just stop thinking about them. They kind of wither on the vine and die. And but some of them don't. And it's the ones that don't that become books, because I keep thinking about them, and I keep going back over them, and I keep adding to them. And eventually at some point, and again, I'll written nothing down, I'll have enough in my head that I feel like I need to start writing it out. So I kind of use the system as a way to hopefully block out bad ideas, because the way I figure it is, if I stop dreaming about this idea, then it died a natural death. It wasn't interesting enough to stay in my head as something that I kept thinking about. So why would I think it's interesting enough to go on a page for people to read? So that's my process. And sometimes it's months, and sometimes it's years that an idea will stay with me. Sometimes it goes away for a while and comes back. But generally, it's a long process of germination in my head, and then eventually I just sit down and I start to write. And that's my process. I had one book, 8 Perfect Murders. The process was the same, but it happened very fast. I was taking a walk and around a pond, actually, around Walden Pond, the most famous pond in Massachusetts. And I was trying to come up with a way to kill someone in a short story I was writing. And I thought, well, what are the great murders in fiction? Like, what were the really clever ideas? Like Strangers on a Train was one that came to mind. And I thought to myself, well, what if someone made a list of the best fictional murders? And then the second thought I had was, what if someone else saw that list and began to use that list as a blueprint for killing people? And then at the end of that walk, I walked for an hour. I pretty much had plotted the entire book. So I knew who wrote the list. I knew who was using the list to kill people. I knew why. And I had, I think, about 6 or 7 of the books on the list. It just happened very fast, and I actually went home and I started writing it right away. So that's the one outlier in my method. Although I guess it's the same method, it just happened quicker. So that's a lot of monologuing up here from me. I don't know how the question is going to work, but I'm happy to open this up to questions from the audience about any of the things I've talked about or anything else.
Peter, this is Carrie, and
Hi.
I don't know if you can hear, but you got a ton of giggles.
It's very strange, this process, and I've done lots of Zoom, but this is strange because I'm looking at myself on a big screen. I'm actually delayed, so I can see my weird hand gestures coming at me after I say them, and I can't hear anything, so I feel like I'm just
talking to yourself.
Who knows? Everyone's asleep. I can't tell. But anyway, thank you for listening to me in this way.
Well, we appreciate you being so flexible because of the weather. Does anyone have any questions? All right, I'm just going to walk up and let you ask them.
You said your first 3 novels were not published. I'm wondering if you've thought about reworking them and trying again.
That's a good question. My first 2 novels were kind of classic whodunits. Not quite cozy, but in that spectrum. Because I was so into the poetry world, and I had been writing poetry and publishing some poetry, not publishing a book of poetry, but publishing in journals. I came up with this idea of sort of an amateur detective who was a poet, this sort of down on his luck poet. In the first book, he gets a visiting writer's gig at a college, and one of his students commits suicide while he's there, and he begins to think it wasn't a suicide. And they were supposed to be kind of comical and cynical and so on. I love that character. In fact, I wrote a second book with him in it. So sometimes I do wonder if those books could come back. But then what I tell myself is, I think they weren't published for a reason. I don't know this. I mean, it's hard to look with any real critical eye at your own work, but I think probably they were early works and they weren't as good as the stuff I've written later. So I think it's Bob Dylan. He never quite said it, but he sang it. As an artist, you don't look back, you move forward. So for right now, they're just staying in the drawers. Maybe one day I'll have horrible writer's block and not be able to write something, and I'll dig them out then. But who knows?
All Guys, I'm running across the theater.
I can see you. I can see a little bit of that. I can see a little bit on the front of the stage.
All right, I'm reaching across.
Hey, Peter, I love your eight murders, and from there I got a lot of ideas to read more. But the one that I love and I think traumatized me was Every Vow You Break. How did you get inspired for that one?
One more time on the last part of that question.
What inspired you to? How did you get your
yeah.
inspiration for Every Vow You Break? I was like horrified, love it and horrified. I was like, oh my god.
I was a little horrified by it as well. I think what I wanted to do, I had written a lot of thrillers that were quite complex. And by complex, I mean they often had multiple characters doing things. You were seeing the narrative through different people's eyes. And a couple of them, they were flipping back and forth from a now and a then narrative. So we were seeing something that was happening 20 years ago, and then we were flipping into the future. And I thought I really wanted to write a novel, like a classic thriller, in which someone just wound up in a bad situation, and we only see the story through them, and it moves forward. We're in that situation with that person. And I had this idea that I wanted to do sort of a gender reversed Fatal Attraction. You all remember that movie, that sort of terrifying movie from the 80s. So I had this idea of a bridesmaid who is at her bachelorette party and gets drunk and sleeps with a stranger. And she doesn't know what to do. Should I tell my fiance? And eventually she rationalizes and she says, this happened, I'm gonna let it go, and I'm gonna get married anyway. But she also has some doubts about this new guy. This should have given it away. And then, so she gets married, and then this guy, this stranger that she slept with, whose name she doesn't even know, is suddenly at her honeymoon resort. He's stalking her, or tracking her down. So that was my first idea. And, I thought a lot about this and what might happen next. And then eventually I came up with the part that I can't talk about, which is really the second half of the book, where things get sort of weirder and weirder. But I often think, you asked for my inspiration, sometimes I think about my books in the vein of other writers I love. And this was my Ira Levin book. So Ira Levin wrote Rosemary's Baby and Stepford Wives and a bunch of great books. And he often wrote these novels like Rosemary's Baby, where it's just, you're just in Rosemary's world, and things are just getting stranger and stranger. And she's thinking to herself, what's up with my husband? I don't trust him. I don't trust anybody. And it's sort of this increasingly paranoid world where you only learn what in this case, the narrator learns. So I really wanted to write this type of book, and this was the idea that I had for writing it. And I'm glad you liked it, and I'm glad it scared you.
We have time for, unfortunately, one more question for Miss. Who's the first to raise their hand? You get it.
Hi. Are you constrained by or guided by the formula kind of requirements for mysteries or thrillers? I mean, is it like, okay, yeah, I got to kill somebody by page whatever, I got to do this, I got to do that. Does that help you just move through it, or is it like, dang, I want to do something different?
That's a good question. I struggle with it a little. I would love to write a really slow burn thriller. I've been reading a lot of Patricia Highsmith, who wrote Strangers on a Train and Talented Mr. Ripley, and she wrote a strange book called The Tremor of Forgery, where I'm not even sure one murder occurs. It might have occurred. But it builds all the suspense out of nothing. But you also want to be careful because I am a thriller writer and I want to entertain my readers. And when you're called a thriller writer, you're expected to deliver some thrills. If you don't, you've just written, a thriller without thrills is, I guess, an and no one wants to read that. So yeah, you have to balance it. But I also work very hard to try and not get caught up in something that feels cookie cutter, or something that feels like every chapter ends with a new reveal or something like that, or try and fight against that. But ultimately, as a genre writer, I need to deliver within the genre, and I want it to be an entertaining, surprising story that people won't see what's coming. But within that form, I do try and be creative enough to try something new.
Peter, thank you so much. And because you are not here to answer more questions in person, is there a way that our audience can get in touch with you to maybe ask a question or to interact with you in the future?
Well, the best way to do that is, I guess, to go to my website, which is peterswanson.com, and that'll kind of, peter-swanson.com, and that will essentially lead you to all my social medias, so you can click through onto Instagram or Twitter or Facebook and message me there. So.
Thank you so much, Peter. We miss you.
Thank you.